So here I've got two pretty small white-tailed deer hindquarters. These came from a pretty small doe that a buddy brought to me to process. And I've said it many times before, when I have myself a white-tailed deer hindquarter, I generally like to butcher it by trimming it up into the individual cuts and roasts that this hindquarter is comprised of. But this was a particularly small deer, and I just don't know that that's going to be worth the effort, because I'm not going to get any big, nice sized roasts that are going to do me a whole lot of good all by themselves later on when I want to cook them. So while I don't ordinarily do this, I think what I've decided to do this time is to simply cut these up and turn them all into grind. And of course, you can make a million things out of your ground venison. Burgers, sausages, meatloaves, meatballs, the possibilities are sort of endless. There is a big batch of sausage that I'm going to be making soon, and I also wouldn't mind having some pre-made hamburger patties. So in this video, I'm going to kind of walk through the process of how I take these doe hindquarters and end up with some beautiful pre-made hamburger patties that will be in the freezer, ready to thaw out and cook anytime I feel like having a good burger. And since I'm not gonna be intricately separating each of these internal roasts and cuts of this hindquarter, I don't have to be particularly careful with any step of it. Of course, as always, I do want to do my best to remove the outer layer of silver skin and any bits of fat that I come across, because of course deer fat isn't very appetizing, nor is the silver skin. So I'm really gonna just start by cutting into this thing, get myself some bigger chunks. Again, it does not matter if I follow the seams or the roasts or the cuts that are in here, because I'm just not gonna be using them. Everything's getting cut up, everything's getting ground. Pretty much doesn't get easier than this when it comes to butchering a deer of any sort. And I've still got the shank attached to this hindquarter, and you know I normally like to separate those and braise them for the most delicious meal. So again, I think their destiny is the grind pile. And that's about it. Our femur bone and our shank completely trimmed as much as we can get off of there anyway. Now I'll just do this other one and we'll be ready to move on to the next step. All right, now that we've got these big old chunks cut away from the bone, it's time to just start slicing them up into some smaller pieces that will be a good size to go through the meat grinder. And as I do that, this will be when I really start looking for getting that silver skin off of there. Any extra little pieces of fat that don't look especially appetizing. Of course, if you come across any of the glands that are in there, you want to get rid of those too. Those pretty much just look like big, gnarly, yucky pieces of gristle. Just do your best to trim everything off of there. Good sharp knife. I'll end up stopping and switching knives or resharpening or rehoning this knife a couple of times during this, because well, I'm using a super sharp boning knife and it just gets dull as we go. And when I'm done, I'd like to end up with chunks of meat about like that, which are gonna go through the grinder very nicely when that time comes. This whole process isn't gonna take me a ton of time because, again, this was a pretty small deer, but I'll just keep going through it until I've got a nice trimmed up pile of chunked up venison. And here we've got all of our chunked up hindquarter meat ready for the grinder. Now, for any good venison burger grind, we have to incorporate some fat because the venison is incredibly lean. So commonly people will either mix that venison with either pork or beef, or pork fat or beef fat. Me, I tend to prefer pork. I just think the fat works a little better in there and the flavor works very well with the venison. So here I've got two full pork shoulders and I'm gonna start cubing these up so they can also go through the grinder. No, I won't be using all of these massive pork shoulders for these hamburgers, but as part of this process, I'm also gonna be making some other things like sausages and meatballs. And all of those things are gonna have pork mixed in with them. So I'm kind of doing some of these steps in one great big batch. Nothing too particular here. We're just slicing pork. There's no wrong way to do it at this point. And once I've got my gigantic pile of cubed up pork shoulder to go along with my giant pile of cubed up venison, I'll get all of it arranged on some baking sheets and put it in the freezer for just a little while. So these pieces of meat get nice and firm, super cold, which is gonna make them go through the grinder much better and give us a very, very nice grind. So I'm gonna get all of this and all of that venison on some of those baking sheets, and we're moving on. Okay, now it's finally time to start grinding some meat, and I'm gonna be using the medium coarse grind plate for all of this. I'll start with the pork, since that's what I happen to have in the freezer first, spread out on those baking sheets, and I'll just start sending it all through, little by little, looking for a nice, clean grind. And that right there is a whole lot of ground pork. Anyway, I'll get this set aside in the fridge while we start getting ready the venison chunks to do the exact same thing. And we've got all of our cubed up venison laid out on a baking sheet, and just like we did with the pork, it's going into the freezer for a little while. Nice and cold, nice and firm, so into the grinder it goes. Beautiful, lean, ground venison, ready to go in our meatballs, burgers, and sausage, and everything else I'm gonna be making with it. Okay, now that all of our venison and pork has been ground, we can finally start mixing it up and making some pre-made burger patties. So into this half hotel pan goes 2 pounds of ground venison and 2 pounds of that ground pork. And I'm sure you can guess where this is going. I gotta start mixing it up. And a quick little pro tip, if you ever have to mix a lot of freezing cold meat by hand, first put on one of these cotton insulated gloves that you might use for handling hot food like when barbecuing. Then just like that, we're putting a nitrile glove right over top. This is an absolute finger saver, especially for an old man like me, whose fingers seem to hurt more and more every year for absolutely no reason. Now, we're just gonna get to incorporating these two different meats together. And I'm not gonna be adding any seasoning at this point, like I would with pretty much any kind of sausage grind. Burger patties are pretty thin. We don't really need to incorporate a bunch of salt and flavors throughout the meat, and I like to leave them unseasoned and decide at the time of cooking how I want them to taste with regards to seasonings and so forth. So we'll just get all that fatty pork distributed evenly throughout all that venison. Nothing to it. And yes, you could certainly use the KitchenAid mixer or something like that if you'd rather use that to combine everything, but really it just takes a minute or two. And that's looking perfectly nice to me. Now we need to start portioning out this ground meat into some individual little meatballs that will become our burger patties. So I've got my little scale here, and I'm just gonna start weighing these out. What I'm going for is a 5-ounce little meatball. And I've found that 5 ounces is pretty much the perfect amount for a relatively standard hamburger patty, such as if you're going to make a hamburger with just a single patty of meat on it. Now, if I was gonna be doing smash burgers, where you want the meat to get pretty thin when you smash it, and also usually has 2 of them on a single burger, I would go with 3 ounces a piece. But for just the one patty burger, 5 ounces is perfect. So I'll just start making a bunch of these 5-ounce meatballs, and we'll be ready to start pressing them into those patties. And just like that, we've got 12 beautiful 5-ounce meatballs. And now I'll just use this relatively cheap aluminum burger press to start stamping out my patties. This thing works incredibly well, and I think it was probably like $8. I'll put a link to it in the description below if you're interested. And using it couldn't be a lot simpler. I've got this package of these little discs of waxy paper, and for each patty we need 2 of these. First, I'll set one of them inside of the little form on this press, and drop in one of my meatballs. I'll center it as best I can, set one of the discs of paper right over top, and then press. Pretty much until you feel like you can't press anymore. And give the thing a little shake, and out falls a perfect patty, already with some wax paper on it, which is especially useful if you intend to freeze these, which I do. So now I'll just repeat 11 more times. Perfect burgers every time. Now, since most of these are destined for freezer storage pretty much right away, I'll first do a flash freezing step, and that pretty much just means I'll lay them out on some parchment paper on a baking sheet, pretty much just like I would do with sausages or meatballs or pretty much anything else. Because when I stick this whole tray in the freezer for just a little while, maybe about 30-40 minutes, it's gonna get them nice and hard. And that way when I vacuum seal them, they're not gonna get all squished and deformed from the very act of doing that. Not to mention, when they're hard, I can stack a bunch of them up on top of each other and nothing will get damaged. So into the freezer these go, and we'll pick it up in just a little bit. And once they've finished flash freezing, it's really simple to package these up for deep freeze storage. Just decide how many you want to portion together in a single bag. When it comes to venison, I'm generally cooking for one, so a couple of patties per package is going to work out real well for me. Got a couple of these small quart-sized vacuum seal bags that they just barely fit into. And then we're just breaking out the old FoodSaver and vacuum sealing it like we would anything else. Perfect patties, straight from the freezer, every time. As for this little beauty that I didn't freeze, well, I think we gotta cook it up. You can cook these straight from frozen, just like if you bought them big boxes of frozen meat patties from a grocery store. But as long as I got one already thawed out, I might as well. Hit it with a little of my burger seasoning. And I'd say that looks like a mighty fine venison cheeseburger to me. What's not to like about that? Delicious venison and pork hamburger with all the fixins. Of course, make it however you want. I thought I'd go with a little red onion, pickles, and some mayonnaise. Keeping it simple, it's winter time, I don't have the grill out, but there's nothing wrong with a classic simple cheeseburger. And like I said, if you're not a big fan of pork, you could absolutely use some kind of fatty beef to mix with that venison rather than the pork. Both work pretty well. It's my opinion that pork works a little bit better. Plus, pork tends to be way cheaper, and I've always got a bunch of them pork shoulders in the freezer. Anyway, that's how I make a bunch of pre-formed hamburger patties with my venison to store in the freezer and have easy access to burger time anytime I want. Check out the video description below for some links to some of the things that I use to make these. And in the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future food and wild game cooking videos. I'm gonna finish eating this burger before it gets any colder. So thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.